What if the
Gosh, my favorite
scandal
part
that
of the
destroyed
workshop
a
was actually just
picture-perfect
sitting down
marriage
and
was never
realizing
confirmed,
how much we
but was
already
whispered
have
for decades?
as far as
Imagine the
increasing
glow
our
of Hollywood's
sales, getting
golden
more
age.
referrals, and bringing more people
Flashbulbs,
into our
laughter,
business.
and a
We
young
don't
couple who
realize
seemed to
it,
have
and Margot
everything.
has a great way of
Sandra
having you
Dee,
sit down and
America's
really just
sweetheart,
put some thought into
the
it
innocent
and
face
realize
of
the potential that you
1950s
already
youth,
have
and Bobby Darin,
in your
the
CRM,
ambitious,
in your
magnetic
contact
singer would
list, in your
conquer the
Excel
charts with
spreadsheet
Dream Lover.
of how you can actually
Together,
increase your
they looked
business
untouchable.
where you stand right now. And then,
Two
of course,
stars
how to
colliding
reach
at
out
the
to new
perfect
people,
moment.
including,
But behind the
I'll tell you, this
polished
was really
smiles and
beneficial for me.
magazine
I have a
covers
new
was a
branch of
marriage
my
built on
business
fragile
called
trust,
Charismatic Cowgirl.
haunted by
Haven't talked about it
insecurity and
much.
bound
so
for
here
tragedy.
today,
Picture
we
it.
figured out
Black
exactly
and white
how
photographs
to
flicker
be
across the
enticing
screen.
about telling people
Sandra
what it's
and
all
Bobby
about.
arm in arm at
Again,
film
bringing
premieres.
more people
His
into the
hand
business.
protectively
So if
around
this is
her
what she can
waist.
accomplish in
Then the
a couple
images
of
started
hours,
to change. The
imagine what
smiles
it's like to
fade,
work with Margot. So I
distance
highly
grows between
recommend that
them,
you
and
jump
soon the camera
into
catches
Margot's
what the
next workshop.
headlines could never say out loud. Rumors began to swirl. Accusations of betrayal, jealousy, and whispered affairs filled the Hollywood night. In Part 1, we explored how Sandra Dee rose from a lonely, controlled childhood to become one of the most beloved actresses of her generation, and how Bobby Darin, a man driven by relentless ambition, fell for her innocence and charm. Their marriage was a fairy tale for a while, but Hollywood has a way of turning love stories into legends, and legends into scandals. Beneath the glitter of movie sets and stage lights, something darker was taking shape. Now, in this second chapter, we pull back the curtain. Behind the gossip columns and studio press releases lies a story of suspicion and heartbreak, of two people trapped in an image they could no longer sustain. The questions that haunted them remain unanswered even today. Was there really an affair? If so, who with? And how did it become the straw that finally broke their marriage apart? Over the next few chapters, we'll retrace the steps of their love and loss. From the bright beginnings in Italy, to the accusations in 1963 that left their marriage teetering, to the final confrontation that ended everything. This is not just the story of an affair. It's the story of trust lost, fame's cruel glare, and the price of silence. It began like something out of a Hollywood fantasy. In 1960, Sandra Dee was at the height of her fame, the luminous ingenue from Gidget and A Summer Place, a face that symbolized the purity of post-war America. Bobby Darin, meanwhile, was the industry's rising golden boy, a swaggering, fast-talking singer whose hits like Mac the Knife had made him a sensation. Their worlds collided on the set of Come September in Italy, and what followed seemed to be the perfect romantic headline. She was just 18, delicate and reserved. He was 24, brimming with confidence, wit, and ambition. To the public, it was a whirlwind love story. To those close to them, it was the beginning of something more complicated. A union born from attraction, but shadowed by fragility from the very start. For Sandra, love was both a dream and a danger. Her childhood had been tightly controlled by her mother, Mary Zuck, who pushed her into modeling at a young age and treated her career as a family business. Beneath the surface, Sandra carried the scars of deep trauma. Years later, she would reveal that her stepfather had sexually abused her and that her mother had refused to believe her. Those wounds never healed. They left her fearful of confrontation, desperate for approval, and emotionally fragile behind her polished smile. When she met Bobby, she saw a protector, someone who could make her feel safe. But the safety she longed for would soon turn into another kind of control. Bobby Darin's charm was undeniable. He was brilliant, witty, and electric in every room. But that magnetism came with its own shadows. Bobby had grown up poor in the Bronx, plagued by poor health and driven by a fear that he wouldn't live long. That fear turned into obsession. He had to be the best, the loudest, the most successful. He fell for Sandra's innocence, but his ambition often outshone his tenderness. He wanted her by his side constantly, not just as a wife, but as a reflection of his own success. According to friends and later accounts, Bobby could be controlling, jealous, and quick to anger when he felt neglected. His restlessness didn't only belong to the stage. It followed him home. Then there was Mary, Sandra's mother, ever present, ever managing. She had controlled every detail of Sandra's career and personal life from childhood. Even after marriage, Mary's influence loomed large. She meddled in the couple's decisions, criticized Bobby, and treated Sandra's devotion to her husband as a kind of betrayal. Bobby, in turn, resented her interference and tried to pull Sandra away from her mother's grasp. This tug-of-war created constant tension. Sandra, caught between the two most dominant figures in her life, was torn by guilt and fear displeasing either one. In public, they smiled for cameras and appeared in glossy magazines as Hollywood's golden couple. Behind closed doors, though, small cracks began to show. Bobby's schedule was relentless. Performances, recording sessions, film shoots, and he expected Sandra to travel with him, to be his constant companion. But she was still a young woman struggling to find her own footing, suffocated by fame and dependency. She rarely had a life of her own, and when she did assert herself, it often ended in conflict. Still, they tried to keep the illusion alive. They had a son, Dodd, and their picture-perfect image continued to grace magazines and red carpets. But beneath the glamour, their emotional bond was already fragile. Built on love, yes, but also on fear, control, and unresolved pain. Sandra needed stability. Bobby needed admiration. Neither could give the other what they were missing inside themselves. And that's where the first invisible fault lines began to form. Even the strongest love needs trust. And when trust is built on fragile ground, it only takes one rumor, one misunderstanding, one careless word to send everything crashing down. By 1963, the fairy tale had already started to crack. What once looked like a perfect Hollywood marriage had turned into a battlefield of egos, jealousy, and suspicion. Sandra Dee was still one of Universal's prize stars, cast in light romantic dramas and wholesome comedies that reinforced her image as America's innocent sweetheart. But the lines between fiction and reality were beginning to blur, especially for Bobby Darin, who couldn't always separate his wife's on-screen chemistry from what he feared might be happening when the cameras stopped rolling. That year, Sandra starred opposite Peter Fonda in Tammy and the Doctor, a gentle, feel-good film about a young nurse who falls for a handsome doctor. On screen, the chemistry between the two was undeniable, warm, charming, and surprisingly intimate for a family film. For the studio, it was exactly what they needed from Sandra. Proof that her girl-next-door appeal still sold tickets. But for Bobby, who had grown increasingly possessive, that closeness sparked something darker. According to their son, Dodd Darin, who would later write about his parents' marriage in Dream Lovers, Bobby became convinced that Sandra and Fonda's connection wasn't just acting. In Bobby's mind, it had crossed into something personal, maybe even an affair. What followed bordered on the cruel. As Dodd recounted years later, his father didn't confront Sandra directly. Instead, Bobby had one of his assistants, a lackey, as Dodd put it, call Sandra on the set and tell her that Bobby wanted a divorce. The order came not with discussion or evidence, but with cold finality. It was a message designed to hurt, to provoke a reaction. Sandra, blindsided and humiliated, denied everything. She insisted that she and Peter Fonda were nothing more than professional co-workers, and that the rumor was absurd. For her, it was yet another test of loyalty in a marriage already strained by mistrust. There's no
my favorite
proof
part
that
of the
anything
workshop was actually
romantic
just
ever
sitting down and
happened between
realizing
Sandra
how
Dee
much we
and
already
Peter Fonda.
have as
No
far
letters, no
as
credible
increasing
accounts,
our sales,
no
getting more
trace of
referrals,
anything
and bringing
beyond
more people
gossip
into our business.
speculation.
We don't realize
Peter
it,
himself
and Margot
never
has a great
commented
way
publicly
of having
on
you
it.
sit down
And no one
really
from
just
Tammy
put
and the
some
Doctor's
thought
set
into it and
has
realize
ever
the
supported the
potential that you
idea.
already have
The accusation
in
seems
your
to have existed
CRM,
entirely
in your
within
contact
Bobby's
list, in your Excel
imagination,
spreadsheet,
or
of how you
perhaps
can
in his
actually increase your
insecurity.
business
But
where
in the
you stand
atmosphere
right
of
now. And then, of course,
1960s
how to
Hollywood,
reach out to new
where
people,
rumors could
including,
destroy
and I'll tell you, this
reputations
was really
overnight.
beneficial for me. I had
Even
a
a
new
hint of
branch of my
scandal was
business called
dangerous.
Charismatic Cowgirl.
For Bobby,
Haven't talked about it
the
much.
idea of losing
So here
control,
today,
of being
we
publicly
figured out
humiliated,
exactly
was
how
intolerable.
to be enticing
His jealousy wasn't
about
just
telling
about
people
love.
what it's all about.
It was about
Again,
power.
bringing more people
Bobby's
into the
world
business.
revolved
So
around
if this is what
control.
she can accomplish
Control
in
his
a couple of
music, his
hours,
image,
imagine
and
what it's like to
increasingly
work
his
with Margot.
marriage.
So I highly recommend
Sandra's
that you
natural warmth
jump
with her
into
co-stars,
Margot's next
her
workshop.
easy laughter, her tendency to form quick connections, all fed into his fear that he was being replaced, even emotionally. And yet, Bobby himself was often distant, wrapped up in his own touring schedule and the pressure to outdo his previous successes. It's possible that his suspicion came from guilt, projecting his own emotional distance onto her. Sandra, meanwhile, found herself trapped. Her career required her to appear open and charming with male leads. Her marriage demanded restraint and loyalty. Between the expectations of the studio, the public, and her husband, she had no space to breathe. To make things worse, Bobby's temper and ego didn't leave much room for reassurance. What began as one rumor turned into a test of her worth, a cruel game in which she had to constantly prove her innocence. Eventually, the confrontation burned itself out. There was no dramatic breakup, no public statement. Bobby withdrew the divorce demand, and Sandra forgave him, as she always did. They appeared together in public again, smiling for cameras, pretending nothing had happened. But the damage lingered. The humiliation of being accused, the knowledge that Bobby didn't trust her, became another unspoken wound between them. Outwardly, the Darins returned to being Hollywood's beautiful young couple, but something had changed permanently. The seed of doubt had been planted, and once mistrust enters a marriage, it never truly leaves. From that moment on, every late call, every film role, every friendly conversation could ignite another round of suspicion. For Bobby Darin, jealousy had become a habit. For Sandra Dee, love was beginning to feel like a trap. By 1966, the glow that had once surrounded Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin's marriage had dimmed to a faint flicker. The magic that began on an Italian movie set 6 years earlier had turned into something brittle. Two people locked in a dance of resentment and regret, each unable to step away without shattering completely. Sandra's career had slowed. The ingenue roles that had once made her Hollywood's darling were drying up. Universal had begun grooming younger faces to take her place, and the public's appetite for clean, wholesome stars was fading fast. Bobby, meanwhile, was evolving, moving away from pop and diving into politics and more serious music. The imbalance between them had become impossible to ignore. It was during this turbulent time that the moment everyone would later call the tipping point took place. According to their son Dodd's account, the final fracture began not with betrayal, but with a buffet. The setting was a glamorous Hollywood party thrown by Joan Collins and Anthony Newley, the kind of affair where stars mingled over cocktails and whispered gossip traveled faster than champagne bubbles. Sandra attended, as did actor Warren Beatty, already a rising heartthrob and a man whose reputation for charm preceded him. By all accounts, Sandra and Warren exchanged nothing more than light conversation, the kind of polite, flirtatious chatter that filled the air at every Hollywood gathering. But for Bobby Darin, even that was too much. Whether he heard about it secondhand or witnessed it himself isn't clear, but according to Dodd's telling, Bobby's reaction was swift and cold. Rather than confronting Sandra directly, he instructed their shared psychiatrist to deliver a message. He wanted a divorce. Not a discussion, not an argument, just a final verdict handed down through someone else. That single act spoke volumes. It wasn't about Warren Beatty. It was about power, frustration, and years of emotional erosion. Bobby, once so passionate about Sandra, now seemed to view her as part of a life he no longer recognized. His career was shifting toward activism and deeper artistic expression, while she felt stranded, defined by an image she had outgrown and by a husband whose world was moving on without her. Sandra, already fragile and weary from years of emotional strain, was devastated. For her, the accusation wasn't just an attack on fidelity. It was another reminder that she was no longer seen, no longer trusted, and no longer wanted. She had built her identity around being the devoted wife, the doting mother, and the Hollywood sweetheart. But in Bobby's eyes, she had become a ghost from another era, someone who represented the naive girl he once saved, not the woman she had become. The press, of course, smelled blood. Rumors of trouble between the Darins had circulated for months, and gossip columns feasted on the idea that a new Hollywood Lothario, Warren Beatty, might have been involved. The studios tried to spin the story, insisting the couple was simply taking time apart due to conflicting schedules. Publicists downplayed it as stress, the industry's favorite euphemism for scandal. But in private, everyone knew the marriage was hanging by a thread. The headlines may have been sensational, but the truth was more tragic. The so-called affair with Beatty was never substantiated, and there's no record of any romantic contact between them beyond that evening. In reality, the entire episode was less about infidelity and more about symbolism. The sight of Sandra talking with another man, one younger, freer, and at the peak of his confidence, may have mirrored everything Bobby feared he had lost. To him, it was proof that his grip on his wife, his image, and his carefully constructed world was slipping away. For Sandra, that night may have represented the first moment in years where she felt notice again, where someone looked at her not as a fading star or a dependent spouse, but as a woman. The marriage didn't end in an explosion, but in slow motion, a collapse that had been building for years. The Warren Beatty incident merely gave Bobby the excuse he needed to walk away from a union already suffocating under its own weight. Behind the glamorous facade, their love had become a battlefield of unmet needs and unspoken wounds. The affair talk, whether real or imagined, wasn't the cause of the end. It was simply the story they used to explain what had already died. The legal end came quietly, but the emotional fallout was anything but. In December 1967, Bobby Darin and Sandra Dee's marriage was officially dissolved. The statement Bobby gave to the press was short, cold, and devastating in its simplicity. "I don't want to be married anymore." No mention of blame or betrayal, just finality. After 7 years of glamour, jealousy, and heartache, the couple that once symbolized Hollywood perfection had become another cautionary tale about how fame devours love. For the public, the divorce confirmed what the tabloids had been whispering for years, that something dark had been festering beneath their polished image. Yet those closest to them knew the truth was more complicated. Even after the decree was signed, Sandra and Bobby couldn't fully let go. According to multiple accounts, including Vanity Fair and Forgotten Hits, they continued to drift in and out of each other's lives. There were brief reconciliations, phone calls, even moments when they lived on the same roof again. Friends said that whenever Sandra saw Bobby, her voice softened, and whenever he heard her name, his mood shifted. Their marriage might have ended, but their emotional tether never really broke. Professionally,
my favorite part of the
though,
workshop was actually
Sandra's
just
life
sitting down
began
and
to
realizing
unravel
how much
once
we
the face of
already
wholesome
have
American innocence.
As far as
She suddenly
increasing our
found herself
sales,
adrift
getting more
in an
referrals,
industry
and bringing more
that had
people
moved
into our
on.
business.
The
We
cultural
don't
tides of the
realize
late
it, and Margot has a
1960s
great
were
way
shifting.
of having you sit down
Audiences
and
no
really
longer
just put some
wanted
thought into
wide-eyed
it and realize the
ingenues,
potential that
but
you
bold,
already have
liberated
in
women.
your CRM,
Universal,
in your
her
contact
longtime
list, in your
studio,
Excel spreadsheet,
quietly
of
dropped
how
her from
you
their
can
roster.
actually increase your
The
business
script
where
stopped
you
coming.
stand right now. And
Her
then, of
last
course,
significant
how to reach
roles
out to
appeared
new
in a
people,
handful of
including,
lightweight
and I'll
films.
tell you, this was really
And by the
beneficial
early
for me. I have a new
1970s,
branch of my
she had
business
virtually
called Charismatic
disappeared from the
Cowgirl.
screen.
Haven't talked
Behind
about it
closed
much.
doors,
So here today,
Sanders' real
we figured
battle was
out
not with
exactly
Hollywood,
how to
but with
be
herself.
enticing about
Years
telling
of
people what
suppressed
it's all
trauma,
about.
the
Again,
sexual
bringing
abuse she
more
suffered
people
as a
into your
child
business.
from her
So
stepfather.
if this is what she can
And her
accomplish
mother
in
Mary's
a couple of
lifelong denial
hours,
of it
imagine what it's like to
resurfaced
work
in
with Margot.
devastating
So I
ways.
highly recommend that
The
you
pain that had
jump
once been numbed by
into Margot's
fame and
next
Bobby's
workshop.
attention now had nowhere to hide. She began to drink heavily and struggle with anorexia, her body wasting away as her emotional wounds deepened. Her son Dodd would later describe how she survived on little more than vodka and cottage cheese, and how her sense of self-worth seemed to vanish. For Sandra, the affair that destroyed the marriage, whether with Peter Fonda, Warren Beatty, or anyone else, became more than a rumor. It became a ghost she couldn't escape. Even though there was never proof of infidelity, the accusation followed her for decades, etched into her public identity as though it were fact. The story fit too neatly into Hollywood's cruel narrative machine. The fallen sweetheart, the unfaithful wife, the has-been. It didn't matter whether it was true. Perception had already become reality. Bobby's post-divorce years were no less turbulent. He threw himself into his music, chasing reinvention after reinvention, folk, protest songs, even political campaigning. But his health was deteriorating, the result of a childhood heart defect worsened by exhaustion and stress. In 1973, just 6 years after their divorce, he died suddenly at the age of 37 following heart surgery. When Sandra heard the news, she reportedly locked herself in a room and sobbed uncontrollably. For all the anger, the pain, and the distance between them, she had never stopped loving him in some quiet, broken way. In the years that followed, Sandra retreated almost entirely from public life, raising their son Dodd and battling her demons in private. Her beauty, once her shield, became her burden, a reminder of a past she could neither reclaim nor escape. The world remembered her not for the trauma she endured or the strength it took to survive, but for a scandal that may never have happened. By the time she passed away in 2005, Sandra Dee had become a symbol of faded Hollywood innocence, a woman who embodied both the dream and the damage of her era. Her story was not just one of love lost, but a life scarred by misunderstanding, control, and the relentless gaze of fame. The so-called affair that destroyed her marriage was, in the end, less a sin than a story. one that outlived the truth and left a fragile woman forever trapped in the myths that made her. By the time their marriage ended, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Everyone thought they knew what had happened, that Sandra Dee had betrayed Bobby Darin, that their fairy tale had collapsed because of an affair. But when you look closer, the truth becomes far murkier, and the line between fact and rumor begins to blur. Much of what we think we know about the scandal comes from one voice, their son, Dodd Darin. His 1994 book Dream Lovers, The Magnificent Shattered Lives of Bobby Darin, and Sandra Dee remains the most detailed account of their private world. Through his eyes, we glimpse the love, the chaos, and the whispers that surrounded them. But even Dodd admitted that many of the stories he recounted were things he had been told. Family lore, half-remembered conversations, or tales passed down in the echo chamber of Hollywood. According to Dodd, Bobby's jealousy reached its peak in 1963. He became convinced Sandra was having an affair with Peter Fonda, and again in 1966, when he thought she had grown too close to Warren Beatty. Yet no evidence, not a single letter, diary entry, or eyewitness account, ever confirmed that Sandra was unfaithful. There were no lawsuits, no public confessions, no studio scandals documented in the press. The accusations existed entirely in the private realm of emotion and paranoia. What we're left with is a puzzle made of fragments, and a portrait of two people who loved each other deeply but could never fully trust one another. In Hollywood, rumor has a peculiar power. It spreads like wildfire through the corridors of studios, over cocktails at parties, and across the pages of gossip magazines hungry for sensational headlines. Once a story catches on, it rarely dies. It just evolves. The affair between Sandra Dee and Peter Fonda may have started as a single whisper, a jealous hunch, or even a misunderstanding. But once repeated enough times, it hardened into legend. And in an industry built on illusion, legends often become more real than truth. Bobby's suspicions in that context make tragic sense. He was a man of towering ambition but fragile confidence, driven by an almost desperate need to control his destiny, and sometimes the people he loved. He had grown up poor and sickly, haunted by his own mortality and obsessed with being taken seriously. When he saw his wife, the radiant, adored Sandra Dee, working closely with other men, laughing with them, sharing the kind of emotional intimacy that acting demands, something inside him recoiled. His fear of abandonment, which had shaped him since childhood, now turned inward, feeding a jealousy that would destroy the very thing he most wanted to protect. For Sandra, the experience was just as devastating, though for different reasons. Having survived abuse in her youth and a lifetime under her mother's suffocating control, she was conditioned to seek safety in others' approval, to be the good girl, the obedient star, the devoted wife. Her world revolved around maintaining appearances, even when her inner world was collapsing. So when she was accused of betrayal, she had neither the strength nor the self-assurance to fight back publicly. She denied it, yes, but quietly, almost as if she expected not to be believed. Her trauma had made her emotionally compliant, vulnerable to others' perceptions, and that vulnerability allowed rumors to take hold. Was there ever really an affair? Or was the suspicion itself the poison, a symptom of marriage already fractured by insecurity and unspoken pain? The truth, as with so many Hollywood stories, likely lies somewhere in between. Perhaps Sandra did grow emotionally close to someone else, searching for comfort in a world where her husband's love had turned to control. Perhaps Bobby saw shadows where there were none, his fear distorting reality. Or perhaps both were victims, not of each other's actions, but the pressures of fame and the wounds they carried from long before they met. In the end, what destroyed their marriage wasn't a single affair or scandalous act. It was the accumulation of silence, suspicion, and hurt, the invisible cracks that widened under the glare of Hollywood's lights. The story of Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin reminds us that in the world of celebrity, the difference between truth and rumor is often just a matter of who tells the story first. And once the world decides what it believes, even the truth can't set you free. By the time Sandra Dee reached the later years of her life, the glow of fame that had once defined her had long faded, but the shadows cast by it never disappeared. The scandal that followed her, that whisper affair said had destroyed her marriage to Bobby Darin, lingered not as a confirmed truth, but as a stain on her public identity. For many who remembered her only from the tabloids or the romanticized image of Gidget and Tammy, Sandra Dee became a symbol of Hollywood tragedy. The sweet girl who lost everything, undone by love, rumors, and the unbearable pressure of being America's idea of perfection. Privately, she lived a life haunted by loss and confusion. In interviews near the end of her life, Sandra confessed that she often felt like she didn't exist when she wasn't being Sandra Dee, the persona that made her famous. The bubbly, innocent blonde adored by millions had become her entire sense of self. When the camera stopped, she said, "So did I." That identity crisis deepened after her divorce from Bobby. Her career faltered. Her marriage was gone, and she had no real foundation beyond the characters she once played. According to Vanity Fair and later accounts, she grew more reclusive with each passing year, battling both the emptiness of fading fame and the ghosts of the past. Her health began to deteriorate as her emotional struggles worsened. Decades of suppressed trauma, from the sexual abuse she endured as a child to her mother Mary's cold denial of it, had left wounds that never fully healed. Alcohol became both her refuge and her prison. She drank heavily, often alone, while maintaining the illusion of composure for the rare visitors who still checked in on her. Her relationship with food grew equally destructive. Anorexia left her frail, sometimes eating almost nothing for days. Those who saw her in her final years described a woman physically diminished, but still clinging to an impossible ideal, the need to be perfect, to remain the Sandra Dee everyone remembered. Her confrontation with her mother late in life marked one of the few times she allowed herself to face the truth directly. When Sandra finally spoke about the abuse she had endured and Mary's refusal to acknowledge it, the conversation ended their relationship forever, but it also freed her in a way. After a lifetime of being controlled, silenced, and shaped by others, her mother, her husband, the studios, she had at last claimed her own story, even if it came too late to save her. Still, the public narrative refused to change. The affair rumor remained a fixture in discussions of her life, resurfacing whenever Bobby Darin's legacy was revisited. It became a kind of shorthand, a single scandal to explain the slow unraveling of two people who had once embodied Hollywood's golden love story. Whether or not the affair ever happened no longer mattered. What mattered was that the world believed it did. That belief shaped how she was remembered, not as a survivor of abuse, addiction, and an impossible industry, but as a woman whose infidelity supposedly ruined her marriage. In that sense, the rumor became its own form of punishment, a myth that outlived both truth and compassion. Her son, Dodd Darin, would later become the reluctant guardian of both his parents' legacies. In Dream Lovers, he tried to make sense of the conflicting stories, piecing together memories of warmth and chaos, love and destruction. He didn't seek to clear anyone's name or cast blame, only to understand. Through his words, we see how his parents were both victims of their own insecurities and the culture that consumed them. His book reframed the so-called affair not as an act of betrayal, but as a symptom of deeper emotional wounds. Bobby's fear of being unloved, Sandra's fear of being unseen. In the end, the question of whether the affair destroyed the marriage almost misses the point. The truth is that their marriage was already fragile, a beautiful structure built on unsteady ground. The affair story simply became the lens through which people could make sense of that collapse. It gave the public a clean narrative to replace a complicated reality. But for Sandra Dee, that story came at a cost. It froze her forever in the role of the fallen angel, the woman whose innocence was both her crown and her curse. When she died in 2005, the tributes poured in, many warm, some shallow, most tinged with nostalgia. Few spoke about her pain or the courage it took to survive decades of silence. Yet behind the myth was a woman who had lived through love and betrayal, fame and isolation, rumor and redemption. The real tragedy was never the affair that might have happened, but the way the world chose to remember her. In life, she was made into a fantasy. In death, she remained one, a reminder that in Hollywood, truth rarely survives the stories we tell about it. Was it really the affair that destroyed their marriage? Or was it everything underneath, already cracking long before the rumor ever took hold? The truth is, no one will ever know for sure. The strongest evidence has always lived not in photographs or confessions, but in the fragile emotions between two people, jealousy, insecurity, and wounds that neither Sandra Dee nor Bobby Darin ever fully healed. Their story was less about one act of betrayal and more about two damaged souls colliding under the blinding light of fame. What we do know is that Sandra Dee was far more than her scandals. She was a woman who carried the scars of childhood abuse, who sought love in a man as restless as she was fragile, and who tried to keep her life together as the world watched it fall apart. Beneath the glamour and gossip was someone trying to heal, quietly, imperfectly, and often alone. Her story is not just about infidelity or loss, but about survival in an industry that demanded perfection and punished vulnerability. In one of her most haunting later recollections, Sandra finally confronted the truth about her past, the secret her mother refused to acknowledge. "He wasn't a saint," she said softly. "He had sex with me." It was a line spoken without bitterness, but with unbearable weight. That moment, raw, unfiltered, revealed the real Sandra Dee. Not the movie star, not the rumor, but the survivor. As the lights fade on this chapter, remember her not as a fallen Hollywood icon, but as a woman who spent her life searching for peace in the ruins of her own myth. And in Part 3, we'll step into her later years, her quiet attempt at recovery, her rediscovery of self, and her fight to reclaim her identity beyond the shadows of rumor.